All right, it's 7 and I think we'll begin. So welcome everybody. What a good turnout. I'm just delighted to see so many of you here. My name is Barbara Slater and I'm moderator for this evening's presentation on behalf of the First Parish in Lincoln and its racial justice journey. A special welcome to our speaker, Lily Geismer, who's professor at Claremont McKenna College, and we'll be talking tonight on the road to segregation, Lincoln, Route 128, suburban liberals, and the long roots of inequality. And welcome also to Elise Lemire, professor at Purchase College, State University of New York, author of Black Walden. And I think, as most of you know, Elise grew up in Lincoln and spoke to us on Juneteenth of last year. I'd like also to acknowledge and thank our co-sponsors, the Lincoln Public Library, the Lincoln Historical Society, and Lincoln WIDE. And WIDE stands for Welcome, Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity. So we appreciate the involvement of all these organizations. Let me also introduce Ben Wells, and who will be our technical guru for tonight, and Jenny Morris, who will be working with him, and also Joan Kimball and Tom Hazlett. Joan has raised her hand, and I don't know where Tom is, but if you're around, Jenny and Tom, raise your hands. People can see you. Joan and Tom will be helping monitor the chat and also the hands, whether the digital hand or your own hand in the course of the discussion after the presentations. So after Elise's introduction, Ben will give us some instructions about handling our black boxes during Lily's talk. But let me first say a few words about the racial justice journey and the issues module. The First Parish has embarked on a racial justice journey this year. We've just completed an intensive, informative, and revealing module about history and culture as they've been affected by enslavement and other forms of racism in this country, particularly in New England. We are now turning our attention to our second module, which focuses on contemporary issues of racism and the ways in which racism and racial disparities permeate our lives and are experienced today. So during the course of the next few months, we are planning events that will explore the living consequences of enslavement and thinking about the ways in which racial and racial disparities which exist across all categories are particularly affecting wealth creation, health and educational access, and environmental justice. So tonight is our first such event, and we hope you will join the others along the way. We start with a look at who we are and how we got this way. Specifically, the residential patterns of Boston's western suburbs that emerged after World War II. We have invited a historian, Lily Geismer, who has researched the origins of these suburbs, to share her perspectives on our origins and evolution over recent decades. Her book, Don't Blame Us, is a fascinating and detailed account of these communities, their residents, their ideals, and their commitments. And I guarantee you, you will be rushing to the library tomorrow to borrow a copy. It is very, very interesting. We know how we tell our story about Lincoln and our neighbors, our history, our natural beauty, our charm. Is there another lens through which our story might be understood? If so, what is that lens? Does it support or perhaps conflict with theories we tell ourselves? What can we learn about ourselves from a different perspective with the use of a different lens? We look forward to this opportunity to explore events of the past half century, really more than half century, and the ways in which they shape current circumstances. So let me again welcome Elise Lemire and Lily Geismer. Elise will next introduce Lily, and afterwards, Ben will give us some instructions for handling our black boxes during the talk. So Elise, thank you.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to the many wonderful sponsors of tonight's talk. I'm thrilled to have the honor of introducing our speaker, Lily Geismer. Professor Geismer is a native of Cambridge, Massachusetts. She graduated magna cum laude from Brown University in 2003 and earned her PhD at the University of Michigan in 2010. The recipient of fellowships from the Carnegie Foundation, the American Council of Learned Societies, the Charles Warren Center at Harvard, and other august organizations. She is now Associate Professor of History at Claremont McKenna College in California. Professor Geismer, as Barbara said, is the author of the very well-received 2015 book published by Princeton University Press entitled Don't Blame Us, Suburban Liberals and the Transformation of the Democratic Party. And she has a new, much anticipated book coming out this March, Left Behind, the Democrats' Failed Attempt to Solve Inequality. In addition to writing and publishing scholarly works, Professor Geismer is committed to reaching the broader public with her findings. She and her work have appeared in the Washington Post, the New York Times, and on NPR. In short, tonight's talk will be given by one of the star historians of her generation. Please join me in welcoming Lily Geismer to tonight's virtual gathering for her presentation of The Road to Segregation, Lincoln, Route 128, Suburban Liberals, and the Long Roots of Inequality.
So just a very quick announcement. We've got a tremendous turnout. I see 180 people, which is fabulous. So I'm going to suggest that everyone turn off their own camera, and we'll just leave Lily's camera on. And that way, that helps a lot with the smoothness of the video. If you don't know how to do that, don't worry, I can do it for you. And likewise, everyone should stay muted during the presentation. So with that, take it away, Lily.
Well, thank you so much. I'm first just going to share my screen. Hopefully this will come through.
Oh, Lily, I may have turned off your camera. My apology.
Oh, okay. Can everyone see my screen now? Is it?
Yes, your screen is great.
And you can see the slides?
We can see the slides.
Okay, great. Thank you so much for this wonderful opportunity to speak and those way too generous invitations. I should add to the list of things that I am a native of Cambridge, but I also went to Concord Academy for high school. So a big part of my formative experiences were in the Lincoln Concord area. And it's a place that's very near to my heart. And I'm sad not to be there in person, although I hear that it's extraordinarily cold from my father, who just arrived from Boston today. So I'm happy to be in warm Southern California and talking to all of you. I'm going to talk today mostly about kind of the experiences in Lincoln and the surrounding areas, and less on the kind of my larger findings of the Democratic Party, but I'm happy to talk about that more in the question and answer. I thought I would start with this quotation, and hold on, let me make sure my slides are working. There we go. In 1959, political scientist and MIT professor Robert C. Woods began his book, Suburbia, Its People and Their Politics, which was a critique of mass suburbanization with a disclaimer that he himself lived in the town of Lincoln. Woods was a leading expert in urban affairs. He would later go on to be undersecretary for the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development in the Johnson administration, and then was the president of UMass. And he deflected accusations in the book that it would be hypocritical that he chose to live in a place that he criticized so strongly. But what he said is that he explained that the town that he lived in was by no means a typical suburb, the kind of suburb that his book was criticizing. And he said Lincoln is undoubtedly an anachronism, and it is probably obstructive to the larger purposes of the Boston region, but it is a pleasant and hospitable anachronism. And while it exists, I'm happy to indict myself. Wood embodied the demographic profile and outlook of many of the new residents who moved to Lincoln and its surrounding communities in the post-war period. And many of these homeowners and shared a view of their communities as distinct from the typical mass-produced suburb like Levittown and seen on shows like Leave It to Beaver. And I want to use this tension as a jumping off point for my talk today, and this idea of there being something so kind of exceptional about places like Lincoln that are different than the larger sort of patterns of suburbanization, and sort of challenge and think about those questions, and also about these longstanding patterns about this question around kind of responsibility and place within the larger region. I will turn to this. So I use that quotation at the beginning of one of my chapters of my book, Don't Blame Us, which both Elise and Barbara mentioned. And the title comes from a bumper sticker that circulated in Massachusetts after it was the only state that Democratic candidate George McGovern won in the 1972 election that declared, "Don't blame me, I'm from Massachusetts." And the purpose of the book was actually to counter those traditional narratives of Massachusetts exceptionalism and liberal decline that were embedded in this idea, in that bumper sticker, and show how they obscured the growing centrality of high-tech growth and suburban professionals in shaping both the state and the nation's priorities. So by looking closely at the suburbs of Boston and the exact nature of liberalism that persisted there, I argue that what was going on in Boston was actually key to larger political shifts, and specifically to understand the professionals who lived and worked along Route 128, to show not the demise but reorientation of modern liberalism and the Democratic Party away from labor union workers in the urban core to suburban knowledge workers in the periphery. One of the things, just to sort of emphasize this, is despite the consistent effort of Robert Wood and many other residents of the Route 128 suburbs to consider the area exceptional, one of the reasons I was drawn to studying it as a scholar of political economy is the ways in which Route 128 itself embodies many of the key transformations that occurred in American political economy since 1945, especially what's known as the rise of the post-industrial economy in society and mass urbanization. So the book aims to connect these larger economic and political developments to the political culture and activism in the Route 128 area. And I specifically focused on the communities of Lincoln, Concord, Lexington, Newton, and Brookline, and the political activities and priorities of the residents who lived there from the period of about the 1950s to the 1980s. And I looked at how the rise of high-tech industry propelled the migration of engineers, scientists, academics, and other knowledge professionals, especially those with families of young children, to move to the affluent suburbs clustered along Route 128. In this particular set of suburbs, the convergence of post-war demographic patterns, post-war demographic patterns converged with their specific identities as spaces of tolerance, beauty, and open-mindedness, and created a especially fertile context for the emergence of liberal politics. I think one thing that's important, and I'm sure all of you know, having living in these areas, is that self-described liberals are not the only people who moved to these communities in the post-war period or subsequently. Many moderate, conservative, and apolitical people also wanted proximity to Route 128 and live in communities with good schools and other amenities. Yet, as affluent families with ties to universities moved to these towns, it further emboldened their distinctive reputations and made them more attractive to a particular type of liberal home buyer, creating a kind of feedback loop. And this, I quote a liberal attorney who was from Lexington in the book, who said he moved to Lexington because he believed the wall-to-wall PhDs and the doctors and the lawyers made it a nice, sensitive, and caring community. Other residents often talked about this idea of kind of moving to a place with like-minded people. And this clustering of like-minded people in Lexington and other Route 128 suburbs catalyzed grassroots political activities for a range of liberal causes. In the book, I focused, just to sort of put up here this idea of what suburban liberalism is and to try to understand it. I focused on the activities around fair housing, the METCO program, environmentalism, peace, and the opposition to the Vietnam War, George McGovern's 1972 campaign, and the campaigns for other liberal politicians, feminism, and also around issues related to taxation. And I argue that these particular issues reflect the class and racial identity and priorities of the affluent, largely white suburbanites who spearheaded and championed them. And this is true of their influence as well. what I found in the book is that suburban liberals achieved the greatest victories in campaigns that proposed individualist solutions to rights-related issues, required limited financial sacrifice, and offered tangible quality of life benefits, which is true in the case of fair housing, Metco, environmentalism, peace politics, and feminism. Issues that threatened entitlements of homeownership, such as property values, tax rates, and children's education, such as affordable housing and two-way metropolitan busing, and also around many questions around taxes, were far less successful. And the goal of my book was to understand how this set of politics contributed to both the persistence of liberalism and the intensification of racial and economic inequality, both in Boston and then throughout the nation. So I use this as kind of as like local case, a case study and community study to think about these kind of larger national political transformations. To highlight some of these dimensions, I'm going to focus primarily on the issues around land use and affordable housing, since they're of such contemporary significance. But I'm glad to address any of these other issues in the question and answer. So I'll turn for. Usually I need to use this map when I give talks outside of the Route 28 area, but I thought I would put it up anyway, so a sense of sort of the area that I'm talking about. The New Deal itself, just first, I want to sort of give some context for thinking about these kinds of larger structural questions that were sort of underpinning the types of changes that occurred in this period. The New Deal itself spawned many of these transformations. As part of its effort to create economic security and opportunity and stabilize market forces, New Deal and post-war bureaucrats developed a vast range of public policies, from mortgage initiatives, tax incentives, consumer credits, and subsidies for home building, along with road construction, that encourage single-family home ownership for whites outside central cities. And so I think this goes back to sort of a critical component of trying to understand the structures is the role of New Deal policy. It's a huge part of when I teach about basically anything that has to do with suburbanization, or really about American history. It's sort of really fundamental to this process. I think what's important in between the period of from 1950 to 1957, the federal government and private developers invested $400 million in home construction throughout Boston's suburban ring. So Boston became a site for this kind of intense mass suburbanization. In addition, there huge federal funding from the Federal Highway Act led to the construction. Oh, I think Ben, you're on.
Yeah, no, I've gotten messages from a couple of participants that the audio is not perfect and they're having a little trouble understanding. If you could speak slower,
Okay.
I apologize.
Sure, I should have also warned that's the New Englander in me. I'm a fast talker, so I know, and I have a lot to cover. So I will try to go as fast as try to go slow as I can. But I apologize for that, and I will keep moving along. Funding from the Federal Highway, the Federal Highway Act led to the construction of several new highways, which made commuting easier for people to live downtown, who worked or lived downtown, to live in the suburbs. And it further led to this kind of deconcentration of homes into this Boston's outer ring. By the end of the 1950s, suburban residents outnumbered urban dwellers 2-to-1 in the Boston area, and fully 80% of metropolitan Boston's white population had become dispersed throughout its suburban ring. The other critical component of the federal government in reshaping the landscape of metropolitan Boston had to do with spending on research and defense, first beginning with the World War II, and then during the Cold War. And a lot of this was sent to Boston's universities, which MIT received the largest amount of funding of any university for R&D related initiatives, and Harvard was third. And this, Harvard, both places sort of stopped having room for growth. And so what happened was a sort of a convergence of that need, coupled with the construction of a new highway in Boston, which is the Route 128 highway. And initially, when transportation developers in the late 1940s had conceived of Route 128, it was actually to ease commuting into Boston and vacation travel to New Hampshire and Maine, and to the south to Cape Cod by connecting a collection of existing freeways. It was initially called the Road to Nowhere because of its semicircular shape, but a key intervention changed that when a real estate executive realized that the building of Route 128 opened up new opportunities for research parks that would be ideal for all this new kind of technology and innovation that was occurring at places like MIT, but where there wasn't enough land for it. And so this led to this kind of new spawning of research parks along Route 128. And what happened, so by 1962, the federal government accounted for fully half the sales of Route 128 industry, as Massachusetts ranked third nationally behind California and New York in Pentagon spending. And this I think one other thing that's really important is these businesses were actually also drawn to moving to Route 128 because of the fact that they could put things like Lexington on their letterhead, that it gave them kind of some of this kind of historical significance. And so that was another kind of draw to them. One of the things that's worth noting is that the new industry that cropped up along Route 128 demanded highly skilled non-unionized labor. It thereby excluded large sectors of the existing population from employment. And with few exceptions, the office parks along Route 128 lacked access to adequate public transportation. Automobile ownership was virtually a prerequisite. So that precluded many poor people from gaining access to all these kinds of new jobs that were becoming available in the Boston area. But it was attractive to this new kind of many of these new kinds of workers. So for communities like Lexington, Concord, and Lincoln, this new growth was both boon, but also created new pressures, especially as developers began to subdivide former estates and farms into multiple plots. In the post-war era, the populations of Lincoln and Lexington more than doubled, and Concord and Newton's populations rose substantially. And the dual pressures from industry and new families caused a significant amount of anxiety among local officials. And in this process, zoning began to assume a greater salience as a means to control land and population flows. And so just for some context, a little bit of context here, I put up I took all of these quotations from various different Lincoln planning documents, but zoning had existed prior to the 1950s, and in Weston and Wellesley had begun to experiment with rigid zoning policies in the pre-war period as a way to preserve both their physical characteristics and economic exclusivity. And both had implemented a set of lot size minimums to safeguard against commercial development, as well as new working class and people of color from moving into their areas. In the mid-1950s, both Lexington and Concord followed this policy and revised their respecting zoning codes to establish 1 acre plot minimums, limit new construction to single-family detached homes, and prevent almost all commercial development. Lincoln went further, and in order to maintain itself as a country town, established an 80,000 square foot minimum, which is roughly 2 acres, prevented all commercial development and multifamily homes. And the establishment of historic preservation ordinances gave the town further power to limit new construction in the area. And one of the things that I think is really important about this is it basically meant that the only people who could move to suburban communities was someone who could afford to purchase a detached home on a 1 or 2 acre plot of land. And so this had a huge effect on racial and economic segregation in the Boston area for a number of different ways. Another critical component of these areas' land use policies that had an important effect was new conservation programs. And so I put up here, this is from the 1958, that Lincoln announced that the unique character of our town is dependent on one factor above all others: open space. And there was a sense that large lot zoning could only do so much because it could only restrict rather than protect new open space. And so Lincoln followed in line with what actually the town of Wayland pioneered this practice, but of setting up land trusts, which was forming a private trust to purchase and preserve the town's natural habitats. And in the first decade of its operation, the Lincoln Land Conservation Trust employed tax-deductible land donations and easements across private property to create more than 12 miles of trails, especially around the reservoir. These programs of setting up land trusts and trying to protect open space locally became further abetted by the creation of the State Conservation Commission program, and especially the establishment of it was done by state law, the Self-Help Conservation Program, which enabled the State Department of Natural Resources to reimburse up to 50% of local conservation commission's land acquisitions. So what this program helped to enhance the open space priorities of towns like Lincoln and Concord as well, who routinely allocated the maximum amount allowed by the state to participate in the program. And it's worth noting that throughout the 1960s, Lincoln consistently received more state land acquisition funds than any other municipality in Massachusetts, which is particularly remarkable given the fact that its population was roughly between 5 to 7,000 residents. By contrast, low-income and industry-heavy communities like Burlington, nearby Burlington and Waltham, were slow to establish commissions, and these municipalities lacked the budget surplus to cover the cost. So it created this certain kinds of imbalances. At the same time, the historic preservation and conservation activities of the state and federal government also significantly enhanced the open space agendas with the creation of the Walden Pond and Minuteman National Parks, and as along with the Great Meadows in Concord. And it's worth noting that by the late 1960s, over 1/4 of the total acreage of Concord had become federal, state, locally, or private-owned conservation land, which I think is particularly striking given the proximity to Route 128 of Concord and Lincoln. And here I put up, this is a map from my book. It's from 2000. It was based on data from 2012, but it shows the amount of land in Concord, Lexington, and Lincoln that falls under some kind of conservation land. And I think it creates has subsequent consequences that I want to talk about. I think what's important is that these land use policies didn't just have aesthetic dimensions. The dependence on property taxes to finance local education allowed and allowing only large lot zoning and limiting industry meant that towns like Lincoln, Lexington, and Concord had smaller school enrollments, less demand for police, fire, and road maintenance, and were thus able to offer better services at lower tax rates than a lot of other communities. And in fact, I put this on the previous slide, but the Lincoln Planning Board openly admitted this. They said that there are sort of their core economic incentives for making these kinds of decisions. Concord's Conservation Commission used a similar logic, and talking about the ways in which that it would save the town the cost of many town services if from having to do more housing development. And I think that this sort of worked hand in hand with the exclusionary effects of large lot zoning to really circumscribe the possibilities of economic and racial diversity within the Route 128 suburbs. Residents in Lincoln and Lincoln, Concord, Newton frequently celebrated their land use policies and building codes as signs of their foresight and commitment to planning. The US Civil Rights Commission came to a different interpretation and argued that the land use policies of these towns in planning, what they said is that planning had succeeded almost too well. And they were beautiful, although their beauty was paid for in part by the ugliness of others. And one of the things that they also said is that the restriction of industry and a diverse housing stock had made, quote, the distribution of resources within the suburbs themselves unequal. They also noted that how little they saw from suburban local planning boards of thinking about how their actions affected the region as a whole. And I think that this is a really important question, that at the same time that these types of this practice was going on, the forces of suburban growth and urban redevelopment were having a significant impact on the region's non-white population. And just for some patterns for thinking about this, these are both from my book. It's a map that shows the segregation of Boston and also the demographic features of the Route 128 suburbs as compared to Boston. And the combination of these forces, coupled with the deliberately discriminatory policies of the Federal Housing Administration, the Boston Housing Authority, and urban renewal agencies, left African Americans across the economic spectrum in the Boston area increasingly concentrated in largely overcrowded areas. By the early 1960s, 80% of the city's African American population remained largely confined to 15 contiguous census tracts in the South End, Roxbury, North Dorchester. And it's difficult with census data to get at the Latinx and Asian populations before 1970, but most evidence points to the fact that there was a very similar patterns of concentration. And this would have large impacts on both employment and education in the years to come. One of the things I want to point out is that I actually think it's not to say that there weren't many residents in the various Route 128 suburbs who were not deeply concerned about the problems of discrimination and segregation in metropolitan Boston in the late 1950s and early 1960s. They just took other means to address their role in it and to think about the problems. And so one of the things the many homeowners in places like Lincoln, Lexington, and Concord, and places like Newton, saw themselves as sort of this sense of sort of distinctiveness of their particular communities, made them sort of not understand the ways in which a lot of these practices were actually in line with larger patterns of suburban growth. And that's one of the things I've really tried to sort of, in my book, I really tried to sort of understand. So so that some of the kind of more structural dimensions, there wasn't often a kind of recognition of that process. The first, but I do think it's really important to go back this question that there actually was a lot of concern and commitment about the larger problems of racial segregation in Boston. And the political issue that really galvanized local residents was the problem of housing discrimination. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, many residents who moved to the various different Route 128 suburbs were shocked to learn about the difficulty that African Americans faced finding houses in the suburbs. This concern fueled the fair housing movement, which quickly spread throughout the Route 128 suburbs. I think it's worth noting that actually one of the core sites for the mobilization of the fair housing movement and around many of the liberal issues that I look at in my book was actually churches, and especially the Unitarian Church played a really critical role in fueling a lot of the kind of being the spark point for a lot of these movements. It's where a lot of people met each other. Another site was the PTA. So people who moved to suburbs and found sort of community and people who shared concerns. The local communities from the fair housing movement, so residents got together to form these local committees, and one of their main goals was to help individual African American families gain access to the local real estate market using tactics like testing. They also staged protests. This is an image from a protest that occurred in Lexington in a case of discrimination against a Foreign Service officer. I think this image also highlights the role of women as key players in the movement. Another critical tool that housewives like the ones featured in this picture organized a door-to-door signature campaign in their towns called Good Neighbors for Fair Housing, asking local residents to pledge not to discriminate. This is a poster that produced by the Brookline Group that I think actually really embodies many of the movement's identity, ideology and goals. And so you see these two smiling families on the one hand, and it shows this and sort of saying this, the message in many ways is that everyone is sort of the same on the inside. The groups, I put up here some of some of the images or some of the quotations from their flyers. The groups frequently adopted expansive terms and ideas of equal opportunity and freedom of choice, but interpreted them to mean that not everyone that everyone who could afford to do so should have the right to live in the suburbs. In addition, the communities most open to residential integration and with the most active fair housing committees like Lexington and Newton also had some of the metropolitan area's most expensive housing stock. And so the number of African Americans who wanted to move to affluent suburban areas and could afford to do so actually represented a very small percentage of Boston's Black population. So the beneficiaries of these committee strategies were almost exclusively white-collar professionals and academics who had recently moved to the Boston area and were looking for homes. These values became replicated in the political system as the groups worked to pass stronger fair housing laws. Through their lobbying and mobilizing, the group was able to get Massachusetts to pass the most progressive fair housing laws in the nation by 1963. Yet the law only addressed discrimination in rental and sales and did not tackle exclusionary zoning policies and offered little assistance to the majority of African Americans who could not afford housing outside of segregated neighborhoods. So it was a really symbolically significant law, it didn't do much to address the root causes of segregation, which would have long-term consequences. Increasingly, the movement of people who are involved in the fair housing movement, many of them began to sort of recognize this and the fact that they were not able to address the issue of affordable housing in their areas, and that sort of was something that took center stage. There was a lot of discussions about this by in the mid 1960s within the various different fair housing groups. But one of the things that they then, there becomes a kind of critical spark point in helping draw attention to the issue, to this larger question of the amount of segregation and actually lack of sort of affordability in suburban communities, which were the urban uprisings of the late 1960s, and especially the release of the Kerner Commission report in early 1968. And so I put up here, this is from the famed Kerner Commission report, which came out and gave a really stark condemnation of the nation's racial problems. And I think this is a moment, there's actually clear parallels in this moment in recent US history to I think the current moment in the aftermath of the George Floyd protest or movement, murder and movement, to kind of have a moment of racial reckoning. In many, it was also coincided with the assassination of Martin Luther King, and many of the suburban communities in the Run 28 area, actually all of them, sponsored townwide study groups or forums to discuss the report's finding. And these conversations led residents to confront the fact that their small African-American populations primarily consisted of white-collar professionals and their families, and that the way that they could really help alleviate the interrelated problems of economic and racial inequality was actually to build low-income housing. The residents in all the communities I study began to take grassroots action to start developing plans to establish low-income housing, or what is now called affordable housing, in their communities. And this effort coincided with a push from the state legislature to also combat the lack of affordable housing and exclusionary zoning practices of many suburban communities. So to tackle this issue of the fact that many suburbs in the Boston area had 1 or 2 lot minimum zoning requirements. In the summer of 1969, the Massachusetts state legislature passed a law that was colloquially known as the Anti-Snob Zoning Act. It's now come to be called 40B, which actually was a 2-step administrative process. It's a very complicated law. The first part was that in communities where their affordable units was less than 10% of the total number, low-income housing developers could appeal local regulations who rejected their efforts to build low-income housing in the communities. It also gave an appeal board set up by the state the power to override local decisions. So Massachusetts was the first state to pass such a law. But I think what's important is it was actually more symbolic. It was more sort of symbolic in its effect than actually the power that was within it. And one of the things that ends up happening is that this complicated process actually, in the immediate aftermath of its passage, provided ways of actually thwarting the construction of affordable housing in many suburban communities, especially as the groups that I mentioned worked really hard to try to get housing established in their areas. This process led to, as other residents fought them, this process led them to largely exhaust their resources and to kind of give up. And I'll give 2 examples of this just to sort of think about it. One was and both of them are in the neighboring communities to Lincoln. One is Lexington. So Lexington, there was a lot of activity in the late 1960s about building affordable housing in the community. And after 40B passed, the town meeting approved an addition to Lexington zoning bylaws for a residential district where 40% of the units had to be subsidized for low and moderate income housing. The policy stipulated the town meeting had to approve any of these rezoning, however, by a 2/3 vote. And the town meeting consistently rejected plans to build in this new zoning site. When the town finally approved a new plan in 1971, homeowners in the adjacent area decried the vote and immediately started an aggressive opposition campaign. And one of the things that's important is these campaigns against affordable housing were not sort of overtly racist or overtly exclusionary. It was often on issues like water drainage, traffic, and concerns about the overcrowding of schools. So it became these kind of quality of life issues rather than kind of other types of sort of opposition, but consistently led to the thwarting of these particular programs. Eventually, these particular all of those sort of lost in Lexington, and then two religious organizations stepped in. One was the Lexington Interfaith Housing Corporation, which proposed a project, and the second was actually the Archdiocese, who proposed putting a set of units on the St. Bridget's Church's property for 16 units. And both of these went through the lengthy appeals process of 40B, and eventually were able to get passed, but led to the development of 22 units of affordable housing in Lexington, and went through like a long process. So that's one example, and I know it can be kinds of weedsy to hear. These are sort of really detailed. In Concord, the Concord one is, I think, is actually really important for thinking about the kind of implications of how land use and environmentalism intersects with questions around affordable housing. In Concord, the fight over affordable housing had to do with one piece of property, which so a group of residents there formed an organization called the Concord Home Owning Corporation, and the organization included several lawyers and actually architects who came up with a plan to develop a set of townhouses that was aimed to fit the local aesthetic of Concord. It was designed by the famed architect Carl Koch, who also designed Conantum. And one of the real issue they had was not in coming up with the plans or even the financing for the program, but it was for their this project, but was actually finding out the proper place for it. The issue was that Concord actually had only 29 acres of land that was available for multi-unit development. And most of the eligible parcels had significant water problems or unwilling sellers. And they eventually were able to find a piece of property on Sudbury Road near the town center that the Wheeler family wanted to sell. And it appeared like an ideal location. It was right next to the Stop and Shop. It looked like a really great location for mixed income housing, but it did have significant soil and water concerns. And the residents who lived near this nearby site fought it on environmental grounds, contending that it was actually the land was actually a wetland. And this battle dragged on in town meetings and went to the state courts before eventually being thwarted. And so I put up, these were the pro and against pamphlets to kind of see this battle being played out. The residents, their concern was that this property, putting a project on a wetland would cause their property significant drainage problems, and so that was a sort of critical part of the concern. So this battle dragged on for more than 5 years in several different venues, from the town planning board, and even the Massachusetts Supreme Judicial Court got involved and approved it, where it received a sanction to go ahead. Where it faced the biggest challenge was then when it had to go under it had to go under the regulation of the or look at by the Massachusetts Department of Natural Resources. which had 4 hearings about the property, and then denied its application on the grounds that the affordable housing organization had not shown that they were going to sort of address these issues of flooding. And eventually this exhausted the resources of the organization, and they gave up on building this property. 3 years later, the town meeting approved an article to purchase the land and for $29,000 in an effort to preserve Concord's rural character. And I think that one of the things that's important is that this acquisition of this site and other open space did enhance the attractiveness of Concord, as well as its conservation, population, and tax rate control objectives. At the same time, these kinds of purchases made even less of land available for development, and further heightened the barriers to bringing mixed income housing to the community. I think what's also really important to look at this case is that it forced local housing activists and environmentalists to fight one another. And a vast majority of these contests ended with the same results: the preservation of open space and economic exclusivity, and a dearth of mixed income housing and racial and economic diversity. And that's true in the Route 128 area, and it's also true similar fights get played out nationally during this period. It's worth noting that Lincoln did actually sort of stand against the tide on some of this, and was one of the few communities in Massachusetts that actually fulfilled its affordable housing 10% quota with the construction of Lincoln Woods and other projects. But it's my understanding that that project itself faced substantial hurdles in the 1970s as it was getting constructed, and the housing primarily went to local residents and town employees. So fulfilled partially goals of affordability, but not necessarily some of the larger racial objectives of affordable housing. Okay, so if the Kerner Commission report was sort of the beginning of this questions around affordable housing, this report by the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights serves as the kind of other bookend. It was published in 1975 at the height of the mandatory desegregation of the Boston public schools. And the Civil Rights Commission's report interpreted the busing crisis as the direct result of the failure of suburban municipalities to take the warnings of the Kerner Commission report seriously. Using statistical evidence and expert testimony, the report demonstrated that residential segregation and discrimination in metropolitan Boston had actually intensified over the course of the 1960s. The authors placed major blame on this pattern on the exclusionary zoning practices of suburban communities, and put to rest any question that resistance to affordable housing was anything less than racial discrimination. And I put up here some of the quotations from it. They assailed 40B and said that it only stimulated suburban communities with new strategies for circumventing racial inclusion. And they warned that unless the state acts swiftly, forcefully, and effectively, suburban residential patterns are likely to be firmly established in a manner which cannot be changed for generations. This statement has proven profoundly prescient. Almost 50 years later, despite the fact that Massachusetts has some of the most expensive housing in the nation, the majority of its wealthy towns have failed to build even a single low-income unit. In all the suburbs I've studied, as I'm sure you're all aware of, the price of property and the median income of residents has only intensified since the 1970s. And I think it's worth noting here, these are taken from census tract data. The racial segregation of metropolitan Boston has largely remained the same from 1960 to 2010. I didn't put in the most recent census information. The ineffectiveness at challenging the exclusionary zoning practices and the continued resistance of residents to take affirmative steps to build affordable housing contributed to these patterns of inequality. One of I think that it's important to sort of note out the other thing that happened of these kind of battles over affordable housing in the late 1960s and early 1970s is that they contributed to pushing affordable housing and exclusionary zoning out of the political conversation for generations. It was not an issue on the platform of parties, and even housing more broadly was not really a campaign issue until the 2020 election. And I think it's worth noting this, it actually did become a major issue in 2020 with Donald Trump's comments about Obama's efforts to build affordable housing in the suburbs. But Obama did not make that a major campaign issue. And the policy that was in question was relatively technical, and HUD didn't announce it until well into Obama's second term. I do think the George Floyd protests and other factors have brought attention to the issues of affordable housing and larger questions of suburban patterns of segregation and discrimination in really important ways. And one of the key lessons of the sagas that I just laid out is that not every suburbanite opposed the concept of living in a socioeconomically diverse community. Many residents fought really hard to force their neighbors to accept responsibility for the problems of racial and spatial inequality. But these actions fell drastically short. The affordable housing efforts never really sparked a conversation about the ways in which stringent zoning policies made questionable sites like the Wheeler property in Concord the only plots of land available for multi-unit developments. Nor did it lead affordable housing proponents and environmentalists in various different communities to recognize that they were in many ways fighting common enemies like federal investment in state subsidized suburbanization and the research and defense industry, as well as local planning policies, which created the lack of both open space and socioeconomic diversity in the suburbs. I hope what this whirlwind tour has offers lessons for the future as you and Lincoln consider ways to make the advantages of living in communities like yours with so many wonderful attributes available to more people. It seems to me that the time for that is more urgent than ever. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
So I would encourage people to turn their videos back on and come rejoin us. Thank you for the wonderful talk, Lily. And
There, I think we're back. Wonderful. Oh my goodness. That was unbelievable, stimulating, provocative, intriguing, and so much to think about. I see hands are up already, and my goodness, Tom, are you able to help me out? How do you deal with
the host has to the host is still blocking the video, so whoever's the host has to unblock the video. We can't do it from our end.
Oh, Ben, that's you. Can you unblock the video?
I have, and if you can't get back on, I apologize. The only thing I can recommend is to sign out of the meeting and come back. But I have turned video back on. I'm so sorry.
And who is the caller up in the left-hand corner? Who we'd be happy to have you speak.
Hi, I'm Tara. I'm from Acton, and I have a couple of questions.
Sure.
So I had started working on a racial justice group in the Acton area And I thought that affordable housing would be the main focus, or a really important focus, if you don't have a house, where can you live? And I was told by Black leaders that focusing on affordable housing was not the place to start. First of all, it linked Black people to poor people, as opposed to racial equity in general. And so anyway, I just wanted to understand why the focus on more building is a solution, it seems, when the problem doesn't seem to be the quantity, but since we're already building in Massachusetts twice the net birth rate, it seems like it's a pricing problem, not a quantity problem. And if you build a new unit, at least the studies that we've been having, it's like $500,000 per unit. And if you rehab and make them more affordable long-term forever, it seems to be a more affordable and quicker way to achieve equity on housing equity anyway. And so I'm wondering why the focus on building, and I'm wondering who is funding this whirlwind tour. Thank you.
Yeah, and so I mean, I think that one of the things that and I would say, so for the question of affordable housing is just sort of housing that is affordable in communities, and it happens that oftentimes that needs to be housing that is built, especially because of the lack of multi-unit buildings that so many because of the kind of nature of post-war suburbanization. Focused on single family homes. And so this is a big question in California too, actually, which is about challenging the ways that single lot zoning is done as a tactic for dealing with the housing crisis. So I think absolutely, if there's existing housing that can be rehabbed, that's a great option. A lot of this was funded through matching grants and actually from the state. And so there was considerable state funding for various different programs to try to build affordable housing. And the federal government actually made a huge push in the late 1960s, early 1970s around the question of affordable housing. That was actually a big issue, a big initiative of George Romney when he became Secretary of HUD. So it's a lot of it came from federal and state money is one, or the federal government and state government for these kinds of constructions.
Thank you, Lily. Let's go on to the next person, Sarah Mattis. Can you you need to unmute?
I just unmuted. Yes, thank you. This was phenomenal. And I urge everybody to read the book. I was especially intrigued by your analysis, which you didn't discuss tonight, about the evolution of the politics of the Democratic Party, which explains a lot about the tensions that we're experiencing today. So I hope that's a talk for another time, that we could perhaps rehost you or have you come back and talk about that. I want to talk a little bit. I'm a veteran of the Housing Commission in Lincoln and 12 years on the Board of Selectmen and many other boards and committees. And most recently looking at property tax issues and the impacts on people, on the implications for our actually more diverse population than you might imagine, economically diverse, not racially diverse. And I came across an interesting factoid that is data from December of this year. Of Lincoln's 1,532 housing units, 913 of them are not single family homes. Many of them are either condominiums, which are more modest, or rental units, and are affordable units, both owned by the town and other. Some of them are units in our senior housing project. I mean, it's big. Senior housing project is the wrong word to senior housing development. But regardless, it's there is a diversity of types of housing available. What we do not have is racial diversity. And there's always been this conundrum of how do we address racial justice issues with just building housing? Because if Lincoln's an evidence of trying to expand housing opportunities, and we're now, I believe, at 14% affordability within our housing, we have not been successful in expanding that to address racial justice issues. And I wonder if you could expand a little bit on that and talk about what you might see coming down the pike where we might be able to make bigger contributions there.
Yeah, I think it's I mean, I don't think housing is everything. I mean, I think it's a sort of, it becomes a convergence of different issues. I mean, another big issue of kind of drawing people in is around issues of transit and access to and what happens around access. And I know that like a town cannot, it's complicated to think about how one town can affect the larger kind of regional transit issues, but I think that's a huge factor. I think there are larger questions within the schools, which of course are related to housing, but finding other ways maybe than just circumventing METCO for allowing a more diverse student population. I think if some of this is about attracting new kinds of residents in. So those are some of the kind of ways that all of those kind of work together to I guess attract a different kind of population. I think sometimes it comes from, I mean, I talked about, you know, there can be some issues with things like the Fair Housing campaign of these kinds of like aggressive tactics, but many suburban communities actually have taken affirmative marketing campaigns. I know Shaker Heights outside of Cleveland in the late 1960s, I mean, from the late 1960s on, actually made a really aggressive campaign to residents of color about living in their community. One of the things, they're an inner ring suburb, so it's a little bit different in their ability to attract, but I think they're a third African American at this point, if not half. So there are efforts like that of kind of active affirmative marketing that can work. That there are certain kinds of political will and money that has to go into that kind of program. And I think it's also sustained commitment, that it can't be just like one campaign. Those are things that sort of take a long time.
Thank you, Lily. And Gary?
Well, Sarah's raised kind of one of the core issues here. You know, in the 1970s, Lincoln recognized that it was going to be swamped by suburbanization, and the concern of the planning board and the people of Lincoln was that they would lose their village character, and the fact that we had a diverse population and that the rise in real estate values was going to essentially drive out all the people that represented economic diversity in the town. And that's what caused them to develop Lincoln Woods. And ever since that time, Lincoln has been in the forefront of developing affordable housing. As Sarah said, we've got about 14% right now. And we're continuing to look at those kinds of issues. And right now we're thinking hard about how to redevelop the area around our mall and transportation center at the train station to provide more opportunity for diversity. But she's raised the sort of the key issue here is that we can build the housing as we have done in the past, but how do we make the community welcoming to, and I have to say, we do have a lot of diversity, but it is largely diversity that's focused on the the intellectual and high-tech community, and we're having increasing Indian and Chinese population. So we have economic diversity in a just general sense, but in dealing with the basic kind of racial diversity issues that face us, we don't know how to deal with. How do we welcome Black people into a community like this where they don't have very many people that are like them? And to me, that's the thing that we're struggling with right now. I can work to build more affordable housing at the mall, which I'm trying to do right now on the planning board. But that doesn't solve the problem. We still have this fundamental issue. How do you make this community welcoming to the broader population?
Well, I think there is, I think this is not, it's a fundamental challenge, and I think it's something that I hope has come up, has been a challenge for a long time, and also is like deeply tied to the sorts of larger structures of the region, and the ways and large scale patterns that have been kind of in place for a very long time. I think a lot of, I mean, a lot of it has to do with a lack of critical mass. And I think that is a sort of core component. And I don't know, I mean, I'm a historian and mostly of the Democratic Party, and not a planning expert. But I do think that this is a question at all levels of kind of wanting to not be a pioneer, or not feel like, a sense of kind of being one resident in a community. So I think that that's a sense of there's a sizable population, and this is often where you see patterns of people moving, and that's actually how you create racial equity too. The same thing happens at, this is a big question around college since I come from a background of being in higher education, it's a huge question within higher education as well. And I think it comes from sort of active, sustained recruitment in some capacity, and a sense of just not one or two people, but a large scale population movement. There are. So,
Thank
yeah,
you.
sorry.
Why don't we go on to Joelle Gunther?
Hi, I was wondering if you could address the issue of how covenants, is that what I said? Covenants in deeds affected the development of diversity in suburbs, and also the issue that affordable housing with a capital A is not affordable with a small a. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think those are two questions. So one of the things, I mean, most covenants were deemed unconstitutional and illegal after 1948, but they sort of set a particular kind of pattern in place within various different communities. And so that you didn't have, I mean, this question of sort of different who moves into suburban areas, that did halt certain kinds of patterns before in the early 20th century. And also those ideas became embedded in larger patterns of properties. They actually affected, like one of the things they ended up affecting, and when I think of this in terms of big structures, but they affected the kind of practices of real estate agents in various different ways. And also federal policy was written in this idea. And there was a huge idea both in terms of policy and in the real estate industry that you should not mix groups together. And that covenants are kind of a product of that as well, but that had large patterns that have been really, really hard to overcome. So even if a covenant itself is invalidated now, and has been since for 70 years, it still has that kind of power about the relationship between race and property, if that gets at the question. And I think that there's a big issue with the question of affordable, sort of who affordable housing is for, and in all of the examples I gave, it was actually largely to a more moderate income people. I mean, I understand. I mean, I think I know a little bit about Lincoln Woods. I did the book. My book was my dissertation research, and I did a little bit of research on Lincoln, on that part of Lincoln for my dissertation research. But it was mostly for town employees, and that was sort of who it was addressed to, is that you could work, that people who were working in Lincoln couldn't afford to live there. So it's actually like that's often who a lot of these units went to. And if that's your question about sort of what's affordable, I think it is also expensive to build, and so that comes to sort of how it as a practice becomes really challenging. So that addresses the question.
Thank you. Jenny.
Hi, I just had a thought that goes back to what Lily was saying earlier to the previous question about how do we get beyond housing to get people as a group. And the model I thought of is, I know there are colleges and maybe some universities working with a group called the Posse Foundation out of Boston, whose model is to recruit a group of young students from a similar area, similar socioeconomic background, to and work with the college admissions to to admit them as a group effectively, so they can be an immediate community and support each other. And when you mentioned Shaker Heights, marketing itself, I thought, well, there's an approach that I haven't seen considered in Lincoln that we might actually say very deliberately, we are trying to get 20 families to come and see if that became a core. So it's a thought to throw to the group. I'd be curious what people think.
Ginny, Lemire.
Well, I was, because my husband was chair of the Conservation Commission during a number of these years, I found it interesting that the author quotes Andrew Shaffey in his book Conservation Commissions, that as she mentioned in her talk, that Lincoln consistently received more state land acquisition funds than any other municipality in Massachusetts, which is particularly remarkable given the fact that the population hovered between 5,000 and 7,000 people. One of the other things that this conservation effort produced was when the state wanted to increase Route 126 to a 4-lane highway, that was stymied by the fact that land on both sides of the road was conservation land, and the state would not allow them to build a 4-lane highway that went over conservation land. Think what a 4-lane highway would do for Walden Pond today. It would be a disaster. So there were other things that the conservation effort did for Lincoln and the environment than just this housing situation. Thank you.
Peter.
Thank you so much for this fascinating presentation. I mean, there's so much depth here, and it's really wonderful to dive deeply into this. One of the things that I've noticed over the years is how helpful 40B is. It's been a great vehicle to help towns, including Lincoln, to focus on creating affordable housing, to avoid having some developer coming in and building something that you don't like, doing it in a way that's ugly and it doesn't match up with what you care about in your town values as to what your housing should look like. It's been a great tool to be able to use. But the thing that is most fundamental to all of this is that we've got communities of color who have been systematically deprived of the ability to create, maintain, and transfer wealth to their own descendants and community. I mean, not just Tulsa, but I mean, really bad stuff. And it's awfully hard to deal with that. But as a nation, we have to deal with that. That's not something we can deal with locally. But one thing that does encourage me greatly is that so many families that I know have now got interracial marriages. And so I think we're really making a lot of progress, particularly in our younger generation, of being one people together. And that's giving me some hope right now.
Peter, thanks. Stephen, before you go, we had a nice question come in through the chat from Judith Glickson. And the question, Lily, if it's possible for you to comment to it, is as a community, have we asked members of the African-American community at large what would make these towns more welcoming? What are some of their responses? And I'm curious from your work, if you've had any experience or exposure to that dialogue and lessons that we in this community might learn from it.
Well, I think the biggest place it comes up is around where I saw it mostly is around METCO. And so a huge part of my book looks at the METCO program, and which I know Lincoln was one of the founding members of and very actively involved in. But I think there was a number of things around the way that METCO is set up and historically to make students not really feel welcome in the communities in which they're involved in, so that they go to school for 12 years in a place that they're felt like they're guests of. And I think that I know there's been existing tensions. It actually works better at the elementary school level than I think some of the at the high school level, which I know has been, which since Lincoln is involved with Lincoln Sudbury is a little bit different. But I think that that's a place where you can kind of see this sense of kind of always a sense of hostility and a sense of separation. And especially, I mean, I think one thing that's hard with Boston historically, different than if I use the example of Cleveland, is it actually has a really small Black middle class. So unlike like other cities that have a large Black middle class population, Boston's Black population itself is quite stratified. And so that creates kind of tensions too, which are challenging. You say like asking Black people, like it's like sort of who are you asking and what is there? But a lot of people who could afford to live in Lincoln, it would be a small part of the Black population. So those would be a couple of places I can think of this sort of the sense of kind of that it's not feeling especially welcome. And I think some of the things that and some of those, frankly, I mean, I will say, I don't think this is true of everyone. And there are many people, I mean, there are many people who would love a community like Lincoln or Concord, but the aesthetics of it are not particularly aesthetics that are appealing to many non-white people. I mean, I think there's a very white aesthetic, and that is something that is challenging. So I think fighting that would be another huge kind of component.
Thanks, Lily. Let's go on to Steve Swenger. You need to unmute.
Thank you. I'm Steve Swenger. I guess I'm sort of a guest. I'm from Sudbury, and I've been a commissioner of the Sudbury Housing Authority for as long as I've lived here, 30 some odd years. And when I hear the discussion about Lincoln, and particularly about the area down near the train station, I wish we had an opportunity like that here in Sudbury. It seems to me that if I were in Lincoln, I'd be looking at the possibility of developing at this transportation node by going down the line and trying to develop relationships in the towns up and down the line for folks who might be interested in living in a place like Lincoln and commuting to wherever it is that they work now by train. And as in terms of the last remarks that your speaker was making, it may be true that there are, to expect folks to come out from Roxbury and Dorchester isn't very realistic. On the other hand, within the Latino culture, it seems to me that a place like Lincoln would be very attractive, a place where you could potentially garden. I mean, you're talking about a site where the community garden is, and that's a beautiful site and a wonderful place. So it seems to me there's a wonderful opportunity there, and that the key to bringing people in is to develop relationships with churches, with social organizations up and down the line. Invite them out to Lincoln to see what the place is like. Have events once things open up and you can do this, maybe in warm weather. Invite people to come out, identify companies where that have diverse workforces, and invite those folks to come out on a Saturday and see what it's like out where you are. So that's my suggestion as sort of an outsider who drives through and would love to have that opportunity at that intersection.
I'll say one other thing to that point, which I think actually goes back to the original quotation from Robert Wood, which is about the ways that suburban municipalities operate, and especially in the Massachusetts area where you have, which is because of the long tradition of localism, that a sense of kind of isolation, even though you're next to another community. I think that's a big question, that every town has its own particular has its own unique housing authority or housing issue, and it's not often coordinated. And I actually wonder about collective action, which can be harder but actually more effective. Like if it's not just about Lincoln trying to fight everything, but actually sort of thinking about it as a more kind of regional effort, that that can often create larger scale change.
Thank you, Lily. Mark, you're up next.
Sorry, I had to unmute. Sorry. Yeah, a couple of comments caught my attention. There was a fair amount of discussion about creating affordable opportunities for people with different backgrounds, or certainly folks with different races. and the other was about the aesthetics of the area that would make it more attractive. And sometimes the two, I think, got confused. I mean, just because somebody is Black doesn't mean they're poor, which is pretty obvious. But I think some of the conversations have gone in that direction. I had an anecdote. One of the companies I started a few decades ago with a partner who was Black, and we tried to get him to move. At that time, I lived in Concord, and I said, "You really ought to come out. It's a great town." Sold all the elements of it, but his response was, "I don't want to be the only one there. I don't want my kids to be the only one, the only Black kid in school." And that was his reaction. And I think a number of us have talked a little bit about that. Is how do you create? I'll use the term marketing program to get to those to the folks who are amenable to making those kinds of changes. And the term marketing came up, and some I think kind of dismissed it. But the marketing is really, in many ways, what it is. You have to understand the different clusters of values of folks you're trying to reach and create programs to reach them. Not everybody's going to be the same by any means, but there will be clusters of folks who once you understand what the values are, you can create strategies for reaching them. I think that, one of the suggestions was to look at Shaker Heights, and I think that makes a great deal of sense. And there must be more places like Shaker Heights where there have been successes that we could look at and create strategies to figure out just how do you understand what kinds of value structures you have to reach to, and what kind of communications do you have to use will be best in reaching them. And again, the mixing of culture versus income is not it's not a good division. So I guess a strategy that creates that understands the values you're trying to reach, and then creates communications that reach those values makes a lot of sense. But you have to understand what those values are. That's my comment.
Yeah, I think it's a hugely important one. And I think to go back to the thing, I think there's a number of things about sort of understanding that's critical. And I do think also, and I know there can be kind of sort of like fear around the idea of marketing, but I do think a thing of research and sort of thinking and doing it as a more systematic approach is really critical. And there are many communities who have taken, it's not like everywhere, and I wouldn't say it's completely in Shaker Heights. In other places, West Orange, New Jersey, but that have sort of worked hard on these kinds of questions. There are several. I can think of some other ones that I can send a list to. And it's not perfectly harmonious by any means. I think there's still real challenges. I think some of the things too, this is also, and especially around African American white, is just the long scale patterns in Massachusetts. But actually, like most of the population in Boston has changed dramatically in metropolitan Boston. Like there's a huge amount of migration and new movement, and that's like to me a critical opportunity for kind of challenging people's sort of longstanding assumptions in various different ways on all sides. So
I use the term marketing because that's assumed to be some that comes across with some negatives attached to it. But fundamentally, what it means is understanding the values of the people you're trying to reach and developing your connections with them based on their values rather than what you think you want to sell.
Tom, do you want to?
Yep, thanks. Next? Thank you very much, Professor Geismer. Thank you so much for an incredible Cook's tour of the suburbs around 128. I'm left with a sort of a guiding question. The information you shared points to the externalities that shaped Lincoln, and I'm completely accepting of the facts and figures of that analysis. What's troubling for me is the theme of individualism versus connection and a larger regional sense of identity in terms of the bigger community. And I'm curious if you've got any examples of communities that have figured out how to see themselves in relationship to the larger whole without the externalities. In other words, does that happen? And if it happens, what are the factors for that happening in other places that you may have looked at?
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, it's where because I'm a historian, not a political scientist. I wish I had and I looked at these. I mean, in all of the communities I looked at, you see very similar patterns. And I think a sense of, and I do think the sense of kind of individual. I think that there's an individualism that's sort of embedded in the processes of certain parts of kind of affluent suburban life, and even the ways in which many Route 128 suburbs see themselves as apart from that. It's still sort of part of the experience, and I think that is one thing that I want to say. I think it's true in many communities that don't necessarily even see themselves as suburbs, so it's often actually tied to like sort of class identity more than anything else. But that is the hardest thing. I mean, I think about this time and time again, especially on the issues of education. Like, it's very hard to get people to care about other people's children. So you see, like, and I say this as a parent, that you see people get really riled up about like their own children's education. It's very hard to say, like, you're going to do something that's going to negatively impact my child, but is good for someone else's kid. That is like extremely hard to push people on. And I think you come up against that time and time again. I saw that in my research, and I see that in my daily life. So that's like a really hard issue. I think in Boston, especially, there's strong and not strong a sense of regional tie. So people say that they're sort of from Boston, but because of the kind of way that you could now live in Lincoln or Concord and never go into Boston, or even like a variety of different surrounding towns, like there's a sort of built-in sense of kind of isolation that I think sort of can sort of magnify those kinds of divisions. And so that's really challenging. So those are sort of vague answers to your questions, but those are places that I see it playing out. But I'm happy. I mean, I think this tie, I mean, I think there's a really challenging, one of the major themes of my book and my research was to try to think about the ways that larger structures shape all of our lives. So if you think about that, like all of those federal policies that shape like every various different decision, they shape my life in a number of different ways. But the ways in which many people feel kind of removed from that, or don't sort of fully understand the way that that has happened. And I'm deeply invested in my larger research and trying to understand this question of like how individuals can change structure, have been shaped by structures, and how they can change them and how they can't. So that's one thing I think it's a really hard set of questions that I've spent a lot of my academic career trying to think about.
Thank you.
Barbara, there's several questions in the chat. One of them is from Janet Medler. How do you see the development of co-housing style pocket neighborhoods as a way to design a more welcoming sense of community to help stimulate moving into still largely segregated suburbs?
Yeah, I think that's one of the questions. Like there are ways of kind of like, and since I'm not a architect or designer, but I'm really drawn to that there's possible ways of designing communities in various different ways, that not everything, that the single family home, like detached home, is not the most ideal setting for everyone to live in, and has all kinds of different patterns. And you can see these kind of alternative living arrangements to that sort of norm that has been established that have been really productive. And I think there are ways of kind of density. There are benefits to density in creating senses of community. And I think especially around common ground. So that is a sort of critical place to take. And there's a lot of work that has to go into those kinds of programs. And I think but I think that's another, can be really a critical way of alternative designs they're really powerful. And actually, I should say, I mean, that's one of the things I found really interesting. Like in the post-war era, in the Route 128 suburbs, there were all of these kinds of experimental communities like Canantum. There were several in Lexington, of trying to sort of design housing in different ways and try to create different types of community that actually brought people together. So there are those examples that like already exist within these various different communities.
Thanks. And Joan, are there other questions in the chat that you want to bring up at this point?
Yeah, there are lots of them. Some of them maybe are ones that ask how much money do you have to live in affordable housing? And I don't know if Lily can answer that kind of question. And then there are others that are sort of more directed towards your talk.
Sure. I
but I
don't
could,
know today what the line is for affordable housing. It changes everywhere. I mean, like it also varies. Like in San Francisco, if you make over, I think it's like $100,000, you can still be like moderate income. So there's like, so it has to do with like where you live. So there's not like a uniform set. You're available, you're eligible for subsidized housing because given how expensive the housing stock is there. So that's one of the things that's hard to answer that. So I don't know in Massachusetts right now what the line is for eligibility. I mean, another issue, there is just a broader question when this goes back to the original question about just an absence of affordable housing that would be deemed affordable right now. And that has to do in many ways, or like fully subsidized housing has actually been, I mean, has been a huge challenge at all scales of governance, and a limitation of the federal government producing housing vouchers. I mean, so there's a bigger sort of housing crisis question that I think is sort of underpinning those as well.
Thanks. Why don't we go up to the corner again and hear from Sarah and then Andy.
Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute. Thank you. I want to go back to Tom's question and this concept of how to think outside of your own distinct town. And now I'm going to put my hat on as Lincoln Historical Society. New England was formed with these units, these towns in the 16 and 1700s, which were isolated from each other. And then Lincoln itself spent 25 years getting itself separated from the town of Concord. So we fought long and hard to be separate and distinct. And that is somewhat the character embedded in New England. Now, I've also lived in the Midwest and the West, and it's markedly different. The sense of regionalism and the interdependency of people in the rural areas of Wisconsin, where I lived, it kind of mandated, the life mandated you think more regionally and work together. And county governments had a lot more power than they do here in Massachusetts. Middlesex County doesn't exist anymore as a governing structure, really. So we have embedded in our history and structure and state law factors that make it very, very difficult to reach across town lines. We do it through, we have regional planning agencies, et cetera, but it's really hard to do, and it's so embedded in who we are and our history and our culture. So, developing those regional networks is a challenge. And I just want to throw that out there to chew on when we think about the challenges for how we work together with other towns. Lincoln has done it with the town of Lexington, Concord, and Bedford fairly successfully through a small organization called HATS, and it meets monthly. And when it's faced with some serious challenges, it coalesces and can be quite powerful. But beyond that, and we worked on, when we were working on Route 2 on Crosby's Corner, we worked with Concord and Acton. But beyond that, through valiant efforts of the Massachusetts Planning MAPC, it's an uphill battle to get any kind of regionalization going.
Thank you. Andy, do you want to go next?
Yes. First, I would like to start by thanking all of you for making time to come and have this discussion here. Lillian, thank you very much for your in-depth study and expertise in these areas. Before I say anything, I would like to, first of all, acknowledge the progress that has been made in this country. Without meaningful, good white people in American society, I don't believe that we would have achieved the level of progress we have done through Martin Luther King and the ones before him and now. So thank you all for making time. You do not really have to be here. After all, you're white. But all of you made time to come and do this. I don't see one size fit all, but it's through small incremental progress that has gotten us to where we are, but we have to continue. So having said that, here are some of my questions, my experience, my concern. I live in Lexington. We moved here in 2007 from New York. To achieve the issue that I believe we are driving at, not just on this platform now, but across the country, of racial equity, it's not going to be solved just by housing. I think somebody mentioned it. It's one piece of it. It's going to take a whole lot more. I believe we all know it. Somebody has also mentioned that, have we asked Black people, not that I speak for Black people, what will make them comfortable to move to a certain place? It reminds me of some men just sit somewhere and decide what the future of women will be without a woman in the room. All of you are very familiar with that. I don't want to go into the politics of it. So I attend with my family the Redeemer Church in Lexington, and there is what was started right before the lockdown, dismantling racism course. And in that course, they start out by asking simple question. What is the cost of racism to whites? It's not zero, I can tell you that. If we are being honest with ourselves, it's not zero. Racism is not necessarily a Black problem. So many angles from our experiences, education. If you really want people to get to middle class and do better, provide them with sound, meaningful education. In Lexington, we fought that with my family to the point where I had to go meet the teachers, meet the principals, and tell them when our kids were in high school, I couldn't believe I'll move to America, go to the top universities here, just to find out that my children will get lesser quality high school education than when I was in Africa. Why? Is the policy. The issue of racism starts very early. The education piece I'm talking about is there is AP classes. There are a lot of AP classes. Go to your school, find out how many Black kids that you bus in are in AP class. If there are none, that's where your racism starts, because you are educating white kids to not see Black children, even at work, as potential top of mind for promotions, for assignments, because they don't see them. We had to write petitions. There are so many processes to go through before a kid who is not selected for AP classes given that chance. We were not happy about it. They eventually did go through, and then each time the next one comes, even when they've gotten A in that AP class, we still go through the same thing. That's really frustrating. So Mark, when you say about your partner who you ask him to move and say doesn't want his kids to be the only Black kids in the school, that's important. Even when they're busting, that's fine. Those of us who moved here got tired of explaining to our children why after school they are moving with their white classmates, and the teachers will see them and say, oh, wait a minute, you missed your bus. The teacher didn't intentionally mean to discriminate against the kid. But what have you told that kid and his or her white friends, classmates? when you go to your workplace, do you look around to see how many other peoples of color in your company? How much interest do you pick in terms of saying, could we give the person a chance to take a good assignment that will lead to good promotion so they can get to an income where they can live in these places we are talking about? Building the houses are important, but creating the perception that you're building it because the blacks are poor can't handle it, wouldn't solve the issue of racism. It will really compound it. So anyway, having said that, I think when you look at what the issues are, it's just not one, it's just not two. There are multiples, but we've got to take them one at a time, take our victories in chunks. That's how we've gotten here. So Lillian, my last question to you is, are you familiar with some issues resolved in California called Manhattan Beach? Okay, so in your research, both in these areas, Lincoln, Lexington, everywhere, were there Black families who were moved or robbed of their properties in those ages so that we can create this area that we see it as a monster now that we're trying to solve? If so, that will be a good start to resolve those ones so that Black people will feel comfortable that there is a realistic attempt, not just to correct the evils of the past, but also to go forward. So I don't know if you came across that. If you did, okay, what do we need to share? Because building the house is okay, but what were the things robbed of people? Somebody mentioned of Tulsa. There are many of that not taught in the history lessons. So
Yeah,
let me let you answer the question.
No, well, thank you for that. Those really thoughtful comments. And I would say, I think that that's a really critical question around, I mean, I definitely think it's not just housing, and housing is one space that illuminates a lot of other issues. And that's often why I focus on it. But one of the things I will say is that there are actually really important models. I mean, I'm amazed at how far the reparations conversation has come in the last several years, and sort of thinking about what reparations looks like and how a variety of different communities are trying and institutions are trying to address it. But I think part of what reparations is also a conversation about restorative justice, and the kind of conversations that emerge from that. It's not just a kind of like check. I mean, it's actually about having a bigger conversation, and that's sort of what a lot of the reparations debate has been trying to kind of further. And I think it's a really important site for thinking about those questions. So another community that I think has been working on this is Evanston passed in Chicago. They just passed a reparations law. And another thing I think is really important actually is in the transportation, the recent infrastructure bill was an effort to address the really destructive impact of highway construction on many communities of color. And it's unclear to me what that's going to look like, but there has been an effort actually by the federal government to kind of come to some sort of place of reparations around its infrastructure building. So those are places that I look to for hope.
Thank you, Lily, and thank you also, Andy, for your perspective on these issues. We have someone in Zoom IT.
I apologize. I can't change the name on my screen. I'm Michael Dolan. I work for the town of Lincoln.
Hi, Michael.
I wanted to mention two things. First of all, going back 40 to 50 years, but my family had moved into Holden, Jefferson, actually. And I was the only African American in the community at the time. And when I hear people ask, what would attract African Americans to the community, I realize at this point I'm passing, but back then you got to realize I was dressing in fringe and had an afro that was probably twice as wide as my head, so I definitely stood out as African American. The experience for me in being in an entirely white community was The two things that stand out most to my mind, I guess, are terrifying and embarrassing. A good example of this was I remember being in math class in junior high, and the teacher was randomly going around asking people, what is the cost of a house? And as far as as far as I knew, I think I was the only person in the class. I don't think I was the only person in town, but I was certainly the only person in class who was renting. We couldn't afford a house. And my answer was so ludicrous that it elicited laughter from the entire class. And that's a very typical experience of what I went through when I was younger. And while there were a lot of people in the community who are welcoming and wonderful, it's just you feel like you're in a cultural minefield. Like everybody has grown up together. Everybody's families are similar incomes. Everybody has similar experiences, and then you come on the scene, or I come on the scene, and I feel like an alien. And what helped was when I finally got to a point where I had gotten to a larger school and noticed the other African American in the community. And then things started getting easier because as I ran into more people of color, the people around them became aware of people of color, and the environment, I would say, is less intimidating. So one of the things I want to point out is that it is frightening to be the only person of your culture, of your type, and that is it's intimidating. It makes it very difficult to try to assimilate into a community. So from my experience, once that ice is broken and you have more people, more diverse people around you, it eases the tension, makes things a little easier. And also people who are apprehensive about people of color, when they're exposed to other cultures, other people of color, they have a tendency to loosen up and realize, they're human as well. So I just want to point out that part of the barrier of not having African Americans attracted to your community is not having African Americans in the community. And the other point that I wanted to mention was, as far as affordable housing goes, it was just I hate Googling because I don't know what kind of information I'm going to get, but my understanding is we're talking basically 30 to 70% of median income for affordable housing, as far as setting it. And I was wondering what the disparity is, because even though we don't like to say that Black people are poor people, there is absolutely a number associated with what the average African American family has versus what the average white family has in terms of assets, income, everything else. And I'm wondering if that is a noticeable gap between what we're calling affordable housing, say within towns like Lincoln, versus what is the average worth of an African American family, because that might simply be a hard barrier that could be overcome with time, but it would take a lot longer. And once again, if you have that solid barrier, it's going to be more difficult to get people into the community, and at the same time make people feel more comfortable about moving into the community.
Yeah, I think that's and thank you for those. I think those are really, really important points to bring out. And one thing, this is more about when people talk about that there's a critical question around the racial wealth gap, which has to do largely with the difference of income versus assets. And I think especially because of the long scale patterns of ways actually that African Americans have been excluded historically, especially from the housing market, because if housing is your first asset that you accumulate over time, has had a long scale impact. But one of the big issues, and this comes up time and time again, is that a lot of things are based on income, but where the huge difference is about assets, and that's not always tabulated. And so that's where you see a huge, especially Black-white difference.
Thank you. We are getting close to the end of our time, and I would like next to call on Joan and ask her also if she has something in the chat to share. And then we'll go to one more, who's the caller, maybe the caller from Acton, whose hand is also up. And then I'll make just a final few comments at the end. Oh, and one more from Howard. But Joan, you go next.
The chat is riveting. It's mostly not questions for Lily, but it's comments on where things have happened that books to read, code switching. There's just a lot in there. And sometimes people answer the questions that other people have asked. So it's sort of very interesting. But I did want to get back a little bit because I had the same question that Tom had. And as I read your book, I noticed the difference between individual sort of actions, which is what we sort of have done through Metco and doing and that wonderful housing thing they did in Lexington. And I'm very concerned about, as we all are, about institutional issues. And I was thinking about education. And is it still 2.5 that's stopping the urban, less wealthy towns from having decent education systems? And is there anything that people in this town can do? I mean, I try to vote for the people that look like they'll help and give contributions to things that are important and, you know, try to work on things. But what can we do? I mean, it's this institutional racism is so troubling.
Yeah, I do think that, I mean, those are the places, and thank you for that. I mean, I think that there's a, there are certain things that to change institutionally have to come, you know, from political action. And I do think, I mean, one of the lessons that I came from my working on this book is that a small group of people can actually make a big difference, and sort of working tirelessly and what could happen at the local level, and especially the power of kind of transforming things. I will say that, and I know this also from living in California, which has Prop 13, which is another of these property tax limitations, like Props 2.5, which have had a really serious impact on education. They're extraordinarily hard to get rid of and to fight. In California, many people see Proposition 13 as unpopular, and they tried to close a small part of it and it lost. It's been really, really hard to fight those things. It's not to say it's impossible, but I think it's like that, becomes just a real barrier. So I think absolutely for certain things have to kind of come from larger action, and it's not what one individual can do. It actually has to come from state and federal action and sort of continuing and persistent pressure from voters and other people.
Thank you, Lily. And then our caller user, is it the Acton caller whose hand is up?
Hi, it's Tara again. Yes, I have some information. The average Black family makes about $50,000, and you'll see that practically all, or at least I would say a very high 90% of all 40B units that are created are between 60 and 80% median or above 80%. So effectively, our fix for affordable housing really is racist in itself, in my opinion. The other thing is that I'd like to just make note that something that a lot of the towns, my friends that are working on, is to make sure that we're working on getting the leadership change so that there are Black faces on the school committee, the housing boards, the board of selectmen, select boards, so that there's familiar faces. And so if we try to be welcoming in general, of course, but it's kind of nice to share the power with people that don't normally get to be, you know, on these boards and committees to set policy. So if we can rally around getting some folks, there's letting people know who might be, you know, people of color, to just say, hey, look, we will campaign to get you elected. And you might not agree with everything they say, but shoot, man, just sharing the power is really a fantastic way to use our power. Anyway, that's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I would just say one quick thing to that, and this is something I have actually thought. I think there's a lot more. This might not be the audience to say it to, because you all have come here on your Thursday night, but I think that there's been a big problem about many people focusing on the national level for politics, especially who are in the Democratic Party, and not sort of understanding the power that state and local leaders have. And that's a sort of, especially at this, I think the state legislature holds a tremendous amount of power in Massachusetts. And so it's important to kind of think about that as sort of thinking about where to direct attention. I think there's been this tendency to like support Senate candidates in other states, and as a way of kind of exerting political power. And I think there's a lot of stuff that can happen at the state level. So that's my rant to build on that point, but it's my other thing I'm really invested in about the Democratic Party. So I'll stop there.
Well, first I would like to thank Lily for such a stimulating evening. I can tell it's gotten so many of us thinking seriously and also creatively about these issues. And I think we'll have an opportunity literally to do more creative thinking because we have the governor's mandate for housing changes along the commuter rail lines and other transport services leading into Boston. Aside from that, I would like to thank Andy for pointing out that it's not just the Black community that has to gain from changes in housing and other arrangements, but also the white community. And I would call your attention to a book by Heather McGee, The Sum of Us, in which she talks about the benefits that we would all have from a society that is less, not more, or continuing to be racist. So I'm hoping that in the next couple of weeks, we can do something with her, perhaps in a TED Talk or a documentary. But meanwhile, I think we've had an excellent start on thinking through and bringing out some of the issues related to residential patterns, households that are distinctly segregated, and the wealth creation that derives from that in very disparate ways. Start on February 3rd, we are going to have an online, a Zoom exhibit called Undesigning the Red Line. You all probably know what redlining is. If you don't, look in the Lincoln Talks or in one of the Lincoln Journal or another publication for the information that'll be coming up. We hope to see you all back here to continue this discussion about residential patterns, racial disparities, and what we need to do to think about and to address them. In addition to thanking our speakers, and that includes Elise, I would also like to thank those who co-sponsored this evening, the Lincoln Library and Lincoln Wide and the Lincoln Historical Society, as well as Ben, who's played a critical role, and Tom and Joan, who also have done the same. You're going to want that book. Robin has said they're available at the Lincoln Library. Be sure to pick one up. Get it tomorrow. It's fascinating, I guarantee you. And come February 3rd to continue this discussion with us. I think it's a good start, and I appreciate all of you being here. And thank you for a very stimulating evening. Any final comment from anyone else? All right, indeed. Well, thanks again, both Elise and Lily.
Thank you, Lily.
Thank you,
everyone.
Barbara.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you much.
Thank you.